Okay, well, welcome. Um, this is Theology on Tap, and we're so glad you're here. We get together about once a month to talk about faith and politics and life and all sorts of things. And we're having more people sign in as we go. But tonight, we are really glad to have Elle Dowd with us. I got to know Elle when she was the missioner for youth ministries in the Diocese of Missouri here at the Episcopal Churches, which was really fun because she wasn't an Episcopalian. And it's always fun to have somebody who can play both insider and outsider at the same time. And we got into some trouble together and had a lot of fun. And we both got here sort of about the same time. When did you start working for the diocese, Elle?
I was hired in November of 2013, but my first day was like January 1st or 2014. But do you remember there was all those like snowstorms and stuff? So it was kind of like, yeah, mid-January, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was brand new in St. Louis. I think I moved in January. So you actually beat me here by just a little tiny bit. But we were sort of both new and both looking at the Diocese of Missouri like this sometimes, like what's going on? And I wasn't even working for a parish at that point. I was on the staff of the presiding bishop, like doing young adult and campus ministries. So right. You and I both had this sort of parachurch thing that was super fun.
Yeah.
But then Ferguson happened, and we were both newcomers. And you had a very interesting position because you were working for the bishop, but you were living on base, right?
Yeah, I was living in St. Robert. We lived off post because I refused to ever live on post, but we lived out there, yeah.
And so you lived on post, but you were coming into St. Louis City, and both of us had this sort of insider-outsider standing, and then Ferguson happened, and we ran into each other out in the streets a bunch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all to say we're going to end up talking about a lot of things that may or may not be related to Theology on Tap and by pride and by furious identity. We may end up more in some of the furious stuff than we might have anticipated even the beginning of this week.
Yeah.
But I think that is the kind of week that we're having. So I was telling Elle before we all got on, part of the hope to have Elle come and talk is we've sort of made a tradition of having June for Theology on Tap be a conversation around LGBTQ questions, identity, theology, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the last 2 years, we've really leaned into the T end of that acronym. You know, we've talked about trans theology. Last year we had folks from MTUG. We had Sarah Johnson with us to come and talk about what it was to grow up, and Sarah did a great job, and it's up on our website if you want to go listen to it. It's great.
Yeah, for sure.
But we thought this year, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, we're having this year that's different, and we've been trying to highlight voices that maybe aren't immediately what comes to mind when you think about pride.
Yeah.
And I thought we'd go to the other end of that spectrum and folks that are sometimes, not as visible.
Mm-hmm.
And you came to mind as somebody that I didn't know, like when we were hanging out, I had no idea that LGBTQ pride was something that affected you personally. And then I started reading your prolific online presence. And I thought I'd ask you to just begin by talking about, like, as somebody who identifies as how you identify and as somebody who presents as you present, like, talk about what pride means, both personally and maybe theologically.
Yeah, so it also makes sense that like maybe we didn't have this conversation right away because I was out, but I was kind of like less militantly out when we first met, and it was actually the Pulse massacre that like made me be like very, very visible and public about it, as opposed to like I kind of went from being out as in like it's not a secret to like telling everybody all the time. But I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one of the reasons was that I was starting to do a lot more reflection on like what it was like growing up and my relationships and the things that formed me. And I was starting to do a lot more like articulation about like why my identity on various levels like matters for how I do theology. And so I think pride is important to me, even though I'm married to a man, kind of for the same reason. It's like the same answer I give when people are like, well, why even come out then? Is that like, for me, you know, I was queer my whole life. I was bi my whole life. I had girlfriends, I had crushes, I had like the feeling of like feeling different or on the outside, and these I had the feeling of like people like people like kind of calling me slurs or like questioning me, and then me being like, no, I'm straight, right? Like that whole thing. And those experiences very deeply formed who I was in a way that it wasn't like I graduated from being queer once I got married, right? So it's like this part of me is still in here, this thing, these experiences that formed my worldview, my theology, my politics, my sexuality, the way I do relationships, the way I think about, you know, raising kids, like all of those things are very, very formed by those experiences that I had as a bi person growing up. And so, yeah, pride has become, I have been more and more out because I realized that like I didn't know I was bi, even though I literally had girlfriends and like crushes on like I had a girl when I was 13 that was called my girlfriend. Her name was Melissa. Like, but I was in denial about being bi because like I didn't know anyone who's bi. I didn't actually really know what that was. So it became more important to me to be like a little bit more visible, especially as I got more educated about some of the risk factors in our community and the way that like it's important for us to like have our voices at the table.
Yeah, I think that that's a it's something that for me as somebody who identifies and has identified as gay, and sometimes I'll identify as queer, and that really depends on the context and what's going on. But like for me, that the very traditional gay label matches my self understanding and my sexuality in such a way that. But it's really interesting to me how many people I have found who are in mixed gender marriages for whom their own identity has become a rather critical factor in how they're seeing the world and I wonder if you could tell a story. Has there been a moment where people have just made an assumption and been like, oh, well, as a straight woman, and that happen all the time?
Yeah. So I first came out like in a more like using a word for myself, like saying like, oh, like I might not be straight. I first came out actually in a lesbian studies class in undergraduate. They made us do all these like journal reflections, and it was just like I was no longer able to be in denial. So yeah, I think there was this situation where I like came out to my lesbian studies class, and it's like a really nice coming out story. Not everybody has that experience. My professor like made me cake and was like, people who should come out should get cake, and it was really nice. And then, but there was this man in my class who, even though like I had come out in class and like we made a whole deal about it and like I was talking about it, he like insisted on calling me straight. And so I sometimes say that bi people have to come out all the time, first of all, because of the assumptions, but even sometimes we're coming out over and over again to the same person, even because there's just like this like lack of understanding.
Yeah, there's even like invectives in the queer community, and it's gender wraps on this so thick. I think. I mean, like I would ask you to talk about, but I'll ask you that question in a second. But I mean, like in the male gay community, there's this like invective of like, oh yeah, bi now, gay later.
Yeah.
Right. Like they're figuring out who they really are, but really they're going to figure that out. Right. But I wonder, could you talk about like, have you in the bi community seen that difference about how women are mapped and men are mapped for bisexuality?
Yeah. So for women, bisexuality is like simultaneously hypervisibility through the male gaze because of pornography, and then also erasure. So there's like this level of, particularly for when we talk about the gender stuff, we can talk more about this too, but especially for like femme women, right? There's this like idea that like maybe if you're bi, you're like, it's actually really still for men, right? Like it's all, the whole world revolves around these like, you know, straight men and their feelings and their desires and fantasies. And so that is definitely a thing that comes up a lot. That was a big reason I had so much internalized biphobia, was because bisexuality sort of in popular media at the time, or just like in conversation, like popular imagination, was like a joke. Like it was like, I kissed a girl and I liked it. Oh my gosh, Cancun got out of control on spring break. Like it wasn't like a real, you know, which like all of those things, or the term bar sexual, which is like, oh, a girl gets drunk and then like makes out with a girl because she's drunk. All of those things are actually still really valid relationships and like ways of being or interacting. Like some people figure out that they're bi or some other, you know, part of their identity, like because of spring break at Cancun or whatever, you know, like all of that is fine. But there is this like huge stigma about it being sort of like frivolous or not real. And so I had all this internalized biphobia around it. And actually, I think what really got me on track for like healing some of that internalization was St. Louis and the very rad queer community there. Like the queer activist community was like, nope. Like I'd always like put myself down, like, well, I don't look queer, or like I pass, or like and had all this like stuff about it. And they're like, nope, yes, you do. Like you are what a queer person looks like. So you look queer, like you're one of us, you count, your experiences are valid. And so having those experiences with like the queer activist community in St. Louis was like really, really healing and important for me, because it really helped undo a lot of those narratives that I had internalized from growing up.
And that word narrative, right?
Yeah.
There's two words that are playing a lot in this, and both of them, well, one of them especially, let's get to narrative in a second, because that's the one that maps with theology so much, right? But one of them is performance.
Yeah.
Right. And gender, and how much, I mean, and gender scholars talk a lot about this, but like, for me, the piece that I hear you saying that I find so interesting is making a decision about when is performance for someone else and when is it be for yourself.
Right.
Like, when are you owning your own identity through the way that you choose to portray it. And performance in the sense of this idea that like all of what we do in some ways is acting out a part in when it comes to gender. But so if you could talk a little bit about that, and then I want to dive into narrative a lot actually, but let's do performance for a second. When did it become that you were, and we touched on the idea of like high femme, but like how you performed your identity for yourself?
Yeah, I think like I tried to, it was really like important to me to like, I guess, pass in high school. Like, and so I, even though like was like making out with all these girls, like I was very adamant, like if it came up that it like wasn't like, it wasn't like a real thing. And so it was almost like I used almost that like stigma as a shield of like, that was my excuse of like, oh, maybe I am just like trying to get attention, or maybe I am just like performing for men, or maybe I am just, but actually one of my favorite definitions of femme is someone who sort of, you know, like gets dressed up in a particular way, but not for the male gaze, but for the pleasure of herself and other women. And I've always like really liked that, because I think there's still like a performance aspect there, but it's like more of like the campy theatrical kind of like myself and more, like more myself, than like trying to fit into some like space that isn't real or doesn't work for me.
Yeah, that gets it almost into like femininity as drag, you know?
Yeah.
And in the sense of like the way that some drag performers and drag folks who claim drag use high femme as this embrace of self, radically. So I want to sit on narrative for a little bit, because I find it one of the places where it's like just really rich theologically, and where a lot of your blogging and teaching I have found really helpful. So you have talked a lot about narratives and like the stories the world tells us about our sexuality, about our body, about our gender, versus the stories that we choose, and the theologies that we choose and the ways that we choose to think about it. And that maps a lot in how we think about scripture too, right? There's the big narratives and there's the big like cultural teaching about like, here's what the Bible says. But then what's so rich about scripture are these counter narratives, you know, the Ruth and Naomi's, the Hebrew midwives, the sort of stories beneath the stories that are such counter narratives. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like what was the dominant narrative around spirituality, around body, around sex, and where have you found counter narratives?
Yeah, so I grew up in a white suburb, middle-class suburb in Iowa, and the church that I grew up in was ELCA, but it was very conservative. It actually left the ELCA after the 2009 human sexuality statement, which allowed same-sex people to like be married, or LGBTQIA plus people to be ordained. So I grew up with a lot of narrative around bodies as like shameful, right? There was like this expectation that sex and sexuality and bodies, you know, like people would say like, oh, sex is a gift from God. But then there was like all this baggage and like restrictions around it. Like sex is a gift from God if you're married, and it really only a marriage is one man and one woman. And like, there's like all this stuff around it. And so particularly also as a survivor of sexual abuse and assault, I really heard a lot of messages that like my body was like dirty and wrong. And I felt really alienated from my body. Like, oh, my true self is like my spirit or my soul. And then like my body is like holding me back, or it's like the enemy, or like the cause of my abuse, or the cause of like this suffering. And so that was like the sort of like dominant narrative or message around spirituality, sexuality, and bodies that I was immersed in. I remember this story. I tell this story a lot, so sorry if you've heard me, all of you maybe have heard me tell this story before, but I have this really vivid memory of being in youth group, and we're like sitting all in a circle, and the youth leader like passes out Hershey's Kisses, and it's like the first person like holds the kisses, and then you like pass the kiss to the next person, and they like smell it, and then you pass it on to the next person, and the next person like unwraps it a little bit, and you pass it on to the next person, right? And so like keeps continuing until it's like, okay, now you can like eat this Hershey's Kiss, and everyone's like, ew, gross, disgusting, no, why would I ever want this terrible Hershey's Kiss? And literally the message was, yes, and if you have sex, that's what you are like. You are garbage that nobody wants, because you're like used and there's something wrong with you. And that was during the time that I was like actively in an sexually abusive relationship. And so the message that I heard loud and clear was that I better not tell anyone what was happening to me, and especially not the church. And over time, I did like find ways of like, I was introduced to some like awesome counter narratives, and particularly honestly, like in the most orthodox parts of our tradition, like the things I really rely on now to like affirm the goodness of bodies are things like, you know, the doctrine of the incarnation, which says that like God became a human being, and when God became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ, like God had a body and still was no less like God or holy or something, which means that God, like, bodies are not inherently dirty or sinful or wrong or any of those things if God is good and God has a body. And like Jesus didn't like sort of have a body, but like did the whole thing, like a birth and like lived and like a death. Like he could have, and you know, there are some like theologies in the early church that like struggled with this and really like asked questions about this, because God could have like just pretended to have a body, right? Or like been a mirage of a body. But like in the most sort of orthodox understanding of Christian tradition, like the incarnation and the way we understand the Trinity and the way we understand all those things is like, nope, God became a human being. Like Jesus Christ was all God and all human being. And somehow like that didn't take away from either identity. And in fact, maybe this like large separation and denigration of bodies, maybe we were wrong about that all along.
It's just so fascinating to hear you talk about it that way, because so often when I hear 80% of what you just said, and then it gets used as a justification for why only male bodies can be, the recipient. So I wonder, like, when was it that your body specifically, that your, attraction and love and sexuality, like, were there role models? Were there, did you see someone who was serving in a particular capacity? Like, what was the, what gave you access to what so often the church has prevented access from people who love and look like you do?
Yeah. There definitely were people, like, I didn't have a woman pastor until I was 21, and that was in California, and her name is Pastor Lily, and she's actually an Episcopal priest. I don't know if you know that. That was like my gateway. It was like this Lutheran church, this like Lutheran Episcopal sort of like pseudo merger, sharing an Episcopal priest, because we're like in the middle of the desert in California, so it's like the only progressive church for like an hour, So that it really helped me. I came to that church in California, and the way I found them was like right after 2009 in the human sexuality statement in the ELCA. I was very politely but not politely kicked out of my home church when they left the ELCA, because I asked a lot of questions, like about, well, how do you know that Greek word means that when it doesn't mean that in any other ancient text in first century Palestine? Or, I was just generally a pain in the ass and putting like a kink in their narrative, right, around human sexuality. So they were like, this is their direct quote: maybe we would be more comfortable and you would be more comfortable if you went to the Episcopal church down the road. And that was supposed to be like the biggest diss, because the call to common mission thing, where we're like in full communion, our churches work together, like this person was like so against that, like thought it was really bad and like against Lutheran confessions and all this stuff. So like it was supposed to be a dig. But when I moved to California, I was like calling around before I moved to be like, is there a Lutheran church here? Like, and then also kind of checking out like what kind of Lutheran church. And it was rural California in like 2010. So the websites all sucked. So I ended up accidentally calling a Missouri Synod church, which is more conservative. And they're like, oh yeah, well, we don't believe in all that, but there is this woman pastor down the road. She's an Episcopalian. And it's like, oh, really? Could you tell me what's
the Missouri Synod were evangelism for you?
I know. So I found my way there, and I came, I'm angry now, but I was like really, really angry then. And I was bi-furious. I like came into that church with like the biggest chip on my shoulder, like very wounded, very angry. And what I was received with was just like abundant love and like acceptance. And it was from two women Episcopal priests who worked at the church. And they were both survivors, and we had some similar histories. And they just basically like received all my anger and attitude problem. And then in return, like gave me just abundant love and like leadership roles, and kept like saying like, yes, and like mentoring me. And so I think it was not only, it wasn't only like that they were women, but like that was really important to me. It was also the way that they related to me because of our shared sort of like embodied history. And it was so cool when I worked in that church office. It was like the youth leader and administrator was a woman, and then there were these two women Episcopal priests, and then it was like me, and they called me the intern, and I just basically did a bunch of stuff I wanted to do, and worked at the Episcopal junior high. And so it was just like so nice to just like be in this like enclave when I had been so hurt by this like cis hetero patriarchal church, to then just be like surrounded. I'm not like a separatist, except for, how in womanists, in the definition of womanism by Alice Walker, she says womanists are not separatists except occasionally for health. And I'm not a womanist because I'm a white woman, but I really resonated with that, because I'm not a separatist. Like, I live with a man, he's around, but it was really important to me to like have that place as I was healing you know, I also had therapy and like the support of my therapist and family and friends. But as I was sort of like healing from this deep woundedness that was also perpetuated by what I would call spiritual abuse in the church, it was so important for me to have this place that really felt safe, these people who had been where I had been and had had similar experiences.
That's beautiful. And I'm very thankful for that. And I wonder, I love that you still identify as bi-curious.
Yeah.
And like part of this is not like I was healed from my fury, because I know that anger is a source of strength for you. I've seen it in the streets and I've read it in your blogs, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you still identify as bi-curious.
Yeah.
How much of it is tongue in cheek and how much of it is real?
Yeah, I like the play on words, because again, with the sort of like that being like bi-curious is like a way to be like, oh, you're maybe like, you're really straight, but you're like dabbling in something else, right? And so I like the play on words for bi-curious. And I also really identify, or maybe appreciate is a better word, the sort of like radical history of Stonewall and like the resistance there and the sort of like queers bash back mentality. And that's like me occupying that corner of that, right? Like I'm bi, and there's like so many ways to be bi and like so much diversity in our community. And I'm bi in a specific way that I'm like intentionally like militant, unapologetic, and like probably mad about it, you know? So, so that has been really, really important to me. I think I preached a sermon once about anger because, you know, Jesus says like, don't, you know, have hate in your heart for people that's like you killed them, right? In like Matthew. And the sermon I preached was like, it's like super interesting that this dude who like just, you know, chewed out the religious leaders and then like later goes on to like do property damage in the temple is like telling us to like not be mad. And so I said that, you know, preachers sometimes preach sermons to ourselves. And I wonder actually if Jesus was reminding himself to like sort of like channel his very justified rage at the oppression of like his people into something productive, as opposed to like turn inward and get bitter. So I have said, you know, before I came out, before I got a lot of therapy and had some healing, I knew that something was wrong, right? Like when you grow up with abuse, you know something's wrong, but I had internalized that something was wrong with me. So like there's like something bad that happened to me, and it was like in the air and I could feel it. And because no one else was taking responsibility, it's like I took it on and I'm like, I guess I'm bad. I guess I'm wrong, right? And a major part of my healing was realizing, you know, actually, no, what happened to me is not my fault. It's not my responsibility. It's not a problem with me. It's a problem out there. It's a problem like that somebody else did to me, but it's also even more than that, a systemic problem, which like creates these situations and allows them to continue. And once I started realizing that, I could move away from shame and move into anger. And so for me, like anger is a huge part of my, I guess, liberation story, because it was saying, it was like, this isn't like, this thing that happened to me is not my fault. And I have the right to be angry about it because I'm precious and beloved by God, and this never should have happened. And so, yeah, I'm like very protective of my anger because it was like a huge vehicle for liberation, and I still feel that way.
No, that's I mean, it gets into that Augustinian sense of sin, right? As you know, Augustine calls sin disordered love. And if you put the love of some image or some narrative that the world is trying to hand you ahead of the love that God has for you as a embodied human being, as somebody who, you know, like that in itself is sinful. And so to be liberated from that, to be allowed to own your story. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, but I also want to say if folks want to ask questions, the chat box is open, and I'll try to keep my eye on. We've got a couple of people watching on Facebook Live too, so if folks want to put questions in there or in the chat, you're welcome to ask questions there. I want to lean a little bit into the bodies while people think of and put in their own questions in the chat, and ask you to talk a little bit about what you're reading, what you're writing, where you are with the body now, particularly as a high femme, bi-curious white woman involved in questions of racial justice. Like, how is who you are What are you navigating as you look at questions around the demonstration of George Floyd and the past demonstrations you've been involved in?
Yeah. So as far as what I'm writing right now, I actually got signed to a book deal with Broadleaf Books, which is the same publisher that did Emmy Kegler's Like One Coin Found or Lenny Duncan's Dear Church, if any of you have read those. And so it will be out probably like next summer because I'm in the middle of writing it right now. But it's actually about my personal transformation sort of from a white moderate into an abolitionist. And one thing that I talk about in there is that the way that my own sort of like embodied experience helped me break through some of my conditioning to find like moments of solidarity. So for example, you know, throughout history, white women and Black men have been pitted against each other. And there's like a long history of white women being untrustworthy, like getting Black men killed, and kind of like the prison industrial complex is like organized around this narrative of like protecting white women from like these bad men of color, right? There's like all of this stuff. And when I realized that that was happening and that narrative was a fuel for the prison industrial system and mass incarceration, I got really angry because I was like, my stories and my experiences should not be objectified as leverage to hurt other people. And so it kind of like woke me up a little bit there. And then I also started paying attention to the way that people were talking about Michael Brown. And when I heard people saying stuff like, oh, he should pull up his pants, it sounded a lot to me like her skirt was too short or she deserved it. And when they would say stuff like, oh, he should have just complied, it sounded a lot to me like, you know, like, look what you made me do. Or, you know, when his initial stop was from walking in the street and people blaming him for that, being like, sounds a lot to me like, why were you walking alone at night? And so seeing the ways that like the narratives of white supremacy, and of course, Black women get both of these things, right? And the narratives of white supremacy and the narratives of the cis heteropatriarchy are like from the same playbook. And it made me really, really clear that about the way that my liberation was wrapped up in the liberation of other people. And I would like to say that I always cared about racial justice. And I think on an intellectual level, I was kind of like interested. I'm really lucky that as I was growing up, even though I was in this like white suburb, I had these teachers who were like, I think you're a feminist. And I'm like, I'm a what? And they would like hand me books, but they didn't hand me books by like Gloria Steinem. They handed me books by Alice Walker and Bell Hooks and Gloria Anzaldúa. So like I was really, really like most 16-year-olds aren't getting that stuff put in their hands in public school, right? So I was really lucky. So I had like a little bit of framework to be like, racism, bad. No. But it really did start to feel different to me once I was parenting Black children. And that made me realize that the sort of like, instead of like an intellectual or moral sort of like abstract right or wrong question, it became, again, this like embodied pit in my stomach, seizing terror. And I realized that that's like what Black mothers had been dealing with for hundreds of years now. So I think that these things are very related and important. And I'll also say that, you know, when we were in Ferguson, I only had one daughter then, and she was like little. She was like 7 and like cute and had like a big bow on her head. Like now my girls
and big signs.
Yes, yeah. Cute signs. Like she's always on my spouse's like shoulders. It was very adorable. She's like a media magnet. But now my kids are 13, and I will tell you that it feels very different to have Black teenagers than it does to have like an adorable Black little girl.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the questions that came in is related to that. Have you discussed being bi with your daughters? And if so, what have you said to them?
Yes. So a thing that I do is I do workshops at churches. The ELCA is like less, I know the Episcopal Church has its pockets too, but the ELCA is even less consistent about affirming LGBTQIA plus people. I think we have something around 9% of our church's congregations are sort of like officially affirming, which is like,
oh wow,
pretty sad. So
yeah, we're probably the reverse on that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do is I go to a lot of churches and give like workshops on this stuff. And so like my kids watch me talk about this, like they come with and they watch me talk about this and explain like to the sweetest great grannies like what all those letters mean, you know? Mm-hmm. So they've seen that. But I also because I grew up in a culture that was like impurity culture and modesty culture, like really shaming of bodies and sexuality, like we are really intentional in our house to have ongoing conversations about sexuality in general. And the way that we frame our like sort of, you know, sex talks, puberty talks, pregnancy talks, like all those kind of things, is we always frame it sort of non-gender essentialist, meaning that like it's not that boys have penises and girls have vaginas, right? Some bodies have penises, some bodies have vaginas. And we also frame it as far as like partners go, that like you can have any partner that you want as long as you're both, you know, consenting adults. So they have heard me talk a lot about being bi, both like publicly and also like in our home as part of like our parenting. I remember when Alice was little and we were playing like Barbies or whatever, she had mermaids and mermen and then a non-binary person. So I think we sometimes like undersell our kids, or like maybe we get so nervous because we like want to get it right so bad that we're like afraid to have a conversation. But actually I think like just talking about it very straightforwardly has really worked for us. And so yeah, we talk about it a lot.
I wouldn't ask you to, as like a follow-up, that to talk for your daughters, but have they, as young Black women or young or teenagers now growing up, like how has it been for them? Have they ever had to talk about their mom's identity in a way that has, or are they, you know, furious as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I like maybe at they go to this like really hippy dippy basically like anarchist school, and I say that like in the most positive light. So I don't think like it would be like an issue, you know what I mean? So it might be like a thing that they had said in passing, but I'm also very aware that like that's not the case everywhere, right? Like we're kind of in a pretty progressive bubble in Chicago, and we've opted into a particular community. So I would be interested in hearing, like I have never heard them experience like any sort of like drama around that at all, but like it would be really different, I'm sure, if we were living somewhere else.
We've got a question. I'm a bi-furious pastor serving in Wisconsin, and it's time to start coming out. Any thoughts on coming out as bi in the church community?
Yeah, I would say that there's like the same sort of like FAQs that you're going to get every time, and I would be prepared to answer them. It's one of those things that's really hard because like actually like our sexuality is like really personal and not necessarily people's business, and then also at the same time forms our identity in a way that we want to be public, and so people don't always know how to like ask appropriate questions. And so the questions you will probably get are especially if you're already married, or if you become married, or if you date anyone, it'll be like, why bother telling us this? Why does it matter? So I would like get really clear with yourself about why it matters to you. And I said earlier why it matters to me, because I realized the way that it formed my identity in a way that didn't stop just because I got married. There is like a misconception that bi people can't be monogamous. There's plenty of bi people who are monogamous. There's plenty of bi people who are non-monogamous, just like other identities. But there's a lot of assumptions that if you say you're bi, that you're non-monogamous, and they will probably ask you. And so I would be prepared with whatever answer that is. And if you do have a partner, they'll probably ask you like what that partner thinks about it. And so, yes. So those are the sort of things that come up a lot. And I think the biggest thing I would do is try to like prepare for the FAQs, and like with your mom or your, you know, best friend or your therapist, like get really mad about the fact that like you're having to like answer these questions, but come to the conversation having your answer and feeling sort of self-differentiated about it, and being able to just be like very plain and direct about it. And eventually you might have to remind them a couple times that you're bi, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I would also say like, to play just a little bit of the like slightly older queer pastor on this too, like, well, I don't identify as bi. Some of what you say I identify with in terms of people when you're in a non-heteronormative relationship, having all sorts of questions about what that means, because you don't.
Right.
And there's stuff that you also have to decide is not their business.
Yes.
And so finding ways to like also cut that curiosity off in a gentle and loving way, which I've only learned through trial and error. But there's parts of it that's like, know that these are the questions, and know that some of them you may feel comfortable answering, and some of them, like, you are in a public relationship with them, not a private relationship with them, and it's not their business.
Yep. You can like, your answer can totally be like, that's private information actually, or that's,
although that answer might get like, ooh, tell me more.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So
yeah.
So finding ways to like, I also find that I can throw Ellis under the bus on some things too, in terms of just saying like, that's between Ellis and me, and I, like, really, like, without him here, without him being in this conversation, I don't feel like it's something that I want to spend a lot of time talking with you about. So but that's, I'm also seeing a question, the favorite leaders, guides, authors talking about the sacred feminine.
Oh, yeah. I should have come with a list, because now I'm like, there are a lot, and I think I am kind of like a nerd for Bible commentaries, actually, which is like a little, I mean, I don't know, it's kind of nerdy. So, but so I even really like, maybe you all didn't know this, but the suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton was also like a theologian, and wrote a women's Bible commentary like way back in the olden days, like 200 years ago, almost 150 years ago. So like, I've really enjoyed like reading those kinds of thoughts through commentaries. So that, and then there's like a more like, there's women's Bibles now, not like women's Bibles, but like commentaries that are called the Women's Bible. But a huge one that I like, that talks not only about the divine feminine, does talk about the divine feminine in a really like beautiful, powerful way, but also talks about the way that shows up in like the women characters in the Bible, is Will Gaffney's Womanist Midrash. And she's Episcopalian, yeah?
She's a Episcopal priest.
Yeah, and she also is a Black woman, so she like brings some really cool intersectional analysis around race too, that I think the Womanist Midrash is something I like give as presents to like all of my nerdy churchy people, because I think it's just like really good, and that the sort of like it's very like academically sound and still really accessible, and so I like highly recommend that one. So I enjoy like the doorway into this sort of stuff that I enjoy, you might be noticing, is through like biblical studies, right? As opposed to like, there's some people who are like really into theology, or some people who are really into, practical theology or something. But I like really love the Bible. And I think it's because of this sort of like narrative, counter narrative, like thing that we talked about earlier. And so my sort of gateway into the divine feminine and that kind of stuff is through feminist and womanist biblical interpretation, which is often found in commentaries.
If I can be permitted, there's it's coming out, but it's not. Christina Cleveland has a book coming out called God as a Black Woman. Cool. And she's doing the writing right now. But if you don't follow Christina Cleveland on Instagram, oh my God, her Instagram is just this like daily respite for me of just incredible feminine imagery of God and Black women. It's brilliant. But Christina Cleveland's done a lot of really great stuff, and the big book's coming out soon.
Exciting.
We're gonna send folks out into breakout rooms, and I am putting a link in the chat. It's just pubtheologystl.org, and the questions are there. I'll read them out for you, but if you follow the link, if you open that outside, you'll be able to have them in the breakout rooms with you. So these are questions that Elle and I sort of worked on together for you to talk amongst yourselves about, and we'll do that for about 20 minutes and then bring you back in for any last question and answer with me and Elle you want to do. So the questions are these. In your upbringing, were faith and your body connected or disconnected? How so? Are there particular stories you can tell or messages you received around the body or sexuality that you embrace or want to distance from? Where have you found, the second question, where have you found your counter narratives about sexuality, the body, and spirituality? Is pride one of those for you? And have you ever thought about pride through the lens of spirituality? And last question, sort of grouping, has there ever been a time that you feel alienated from your body? What contributed to this alienation? What was that like? What places, experiences, or things help you feel most connected to your body? What parts of your body feel particularly holy, divine, or spiritual today? So again, you can follow it in the chat, or I'll put it in the comments on Facebook. But if you're in with us on the Zoom, you're about to be sent to a breakout room. And if you lose the link, it's okay. It's just pubtheologystl.org. That'll take you to the questions. So through the magic of Zoom, you're about to go to breakout rooms.